briefing series on violent online political extremism, which we organize in cooperation with Voxpol. My name is Ona Landuit, and I'm the team leader of the political section of the European Commission representation in Belgium, and I'll be again your host for today. Before I present to you our distinguished speaker, let me briefly recall who we are and why we organized this, why we decided to organize this series. First of all, who are we? Our service, the European Commission representation in Belgium, is part of a network of 37 representations of the Commission throughout the European Union. We are so-called embassies of the Commission in the member states, and we belong to the Commission's Director General for Communication. We are considered a presidential service. This means that we are seen or mandated by the president to be his eyes, his ears, and his voice on the ground in our respective member state. So that's why communication and consultation, of course, is with a wide array of Belgian stakeholders is an essential part of our daily work. We regularly touch base with our stakeholders, with you, such as today, to consult you, to brief you on the different policy fields of EU action, of the European Commission action, of course, and in a way that is as relevant as possible to the reality in your member state. So, as I say, in Belgium in this case. Throughout this briefing series, we have been focusing on one particular strand of EU action, that is the fight against online radicalization and disinformation. And radicalization and extreme views, they have always existed, but new technologies, growing polarization in society, they make them a particular threat, especially to the young people. Given the post-electoral and political context in Belgium, the increased presence of political extremism on social media, we believe it is of added value to provide our Belgian and to a wider extent our European stakeholders with food for thought and action, allowing them to engage in the national or local debate and weigh eventually on future policy on these matters. This briefing series also fits very well into the European Commission's corporate campaign, EU Protects. This is a corporate campaign which shows how collaboration between member states is key to find solutions to common challenges and to protect citizens against certain or several hazards or risks. Well, now over to our partner, Voxpol. The Voxpol Network of Excellence is a fantastic example of this most needed collaboration between member states, which I've just mentioned. Louisa is again here, our project coordinator of the Voxpol Network, with whom we've been working fantastically in the past 5 series and also today. And of course, our speaker for today, Reem Ahmed, is part of the broad network of Voxpol researchers, and she will be our speaker for this last session. Some additional words on Voxpol maybe. So some of you already know very well, but the others who are new to the audience might benefit from this info. They are an EU-funded academic research project, now in its final year of operation, and they are focusing on the prevalence, the contours, the functions, and the impacts of online political extremism and the responses to it. This series, and I'm saying this on behalf of Voxpol, is really vital to the project's mission. Next to researching these fields, of course, their aim is also to distribute, to share their research as widely as possible. In the past sessions, we talked about EU actions to prevent online radicalization. We also EU action to prevent or to tackle disinformation. We presented research on the evolution and the spreading of disinformation on the web and through our social media. We discussed policy recommendations made to the Belgian government and also concrete actions in Belgium and France in the fight against disinformation, which were conducted by local or other EU-funded organizations, such as or non-governmental organizations, such as EU Disinfo Lab, which we also had as a speaker a few weeks ago. Then in the next session, we discussed together with Professor Conway from the Voxpol Network the interesting concept of online ecology, which is the relationships between the let's say, the interactions of extremist online actors with online platforms and more traditional media and websites. And last week, Voxpol researcher Zoe Reeve, she enlightened us on her recent research on engaging with the online extremist violent materials itself on the basis of the student experiment which she conducted. And she also informed us about the research she performed with practitioners in the fields, such as some of you here today, who are in touch with this online extremist and, in some cases, violent material on a daily basis. So today we have the great pleasure to close our briefing series with a premiere. Today is the official launch of Voxpol's brand new publication, published really today here in your presence. The publication is entitled "How Extreme is the European Far Right?" And it was materialized by Reem Ahmed and Daniela Pisoiu, both researchers active in the framework of Voxpol. Reem is a researcher at the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy at the University of Hamburg, working in the framework of Voxpol, as I said, and she's also a PhD candidate at the Albrecht Mendelssohn Bartholdy Graduate School of Law, linked to the Hamburg University, and her dissertation examines responses to online extremism, particularly in the UK, in Germany, and also in the broader context of the European Union. She previously published also in the area of radicalization and extremism, online extremism, with a particular focus on the far right and violent jihads. Today, she'll present to you the results of her investigating overlaps in notably the German far right scene on Twitter. So, as I said, the brand new publication is at your disposal in the back of the room, and as usual, before I hand over the floor to Reem, after the presentation, we'd be very happy to hear your thoughts and questions, remarks. Today's session is again live streamed, only the presentation, not the Q&A. And those who want to follow us on social media, they can. Over there on the slide, you see the hashtags and handles, so you can also be active via Twitter and Facebook. Thanks so much, and Reem, the floor is now yours.
Thank you so much, Una, for the nice introduction. As Una said, I'm really pleased to present the latest report in the Voxpol publication series, and this was written by myself and my co-author, Dr. Daniela Pisoiu. It's quite a lengthy report, so I would like to present the main findings over the next 30 to 40 minutes. I will start with some definitions surrounding what we mean by the far right spectrum, and then I will delve into the two parts of the report, which contain the quantitative and qualitative analyses. So when we talk about the far right in general, it's by no means a homogeneous group. We can rather understand it as a spectrum spanning varying degrees of extremism and activism, ranging from racial supremacy to cultural exclusion. Traditionally, within the literature, as academics within studying the far right, we tend to differentiate between extreme and the radical right. The extreme right mostly comprises vigilante groups or subcultures, also political parties in some cases, but the main aspect is that they are openly racist, they have clear ties to fascism, and they also employ violence and aggressive tactics. In addition to this, they tend to reject procedural democracy. The radical right, in contrast, predominantly is, as we know in the formation today, is right-wing populist parties. They tend to accept procedural democracy, and they have successfully distanced themselves from fascism. They do not tend to engage in violence, and they, unlike their extremist counterparts, they draw the lines on culture rather than race. But as we're seeing, and as Felix and Leroy said in 2016, the clear-cut boundaries between parties, movements, and subcultural actors are increasingly becoming obsolete. That's not to say that neo-Nazi parties such as Golden Dawn in Greece or the neo-Nazi party, the NPD in Germany, are the same as the AfD in Germany, the Alternative for Germany, and the Freedom Party in Austria. But we are witnessing an increased threat from right-wing violence, and the radical populist right are making electoral gains across Europe. Therefore, it is important to probe why this is happening and if they have anything to do with each other. So Daniela and I were looking at, overall, to what extent do these groups talk about the same issues in the same way, in spite of the apparent differences in tone and ideologies. So in the beginning, we did a pilot study, so an exploratory study, which was quantitative in nature. And this was data collected by Voxpol researchers across the network with the help of computer scientists within the network. We identified 175 EU-based extreme right Twitter accounts, and by extreme, specifically, the content was explicitly racist with neo-Nazi, white supremacist, and anti-Semitic themes. That said, and a finding in itself, it was already difficult at this stage to distinguish between the extremist accounts and the radical right-wing populist anti-immigration accounts. We collected 388,795 tweets between September 2015 and September 2016, so the period of a year. This was collected via the Twitter streaming API. The time frame is important. The majority of the tweets actually come from the latter end of the sample, so I would say April to September 2016, but this is because of the Twitter API limits at the time of 3,000, the most recent 3,200 tweets. Again, in the time period, the migration crisis was still a big issue, especially amongst the far right, of course. The Brexit vote had happened in June 2016, so there was the prelude and also the aftermath, and the US was in the midst of a three-barrel presidential election between a populist candidate such as Donald Trump against what was seen as an figure of the establishment, Hillary Clinton. There were also 5 regional elections taking place in Germany and a presidential election taking place in Austria, where the runner-up was from the populist right-wing party, the Freedom Party of Austria. In terms of representation, English was the most prominent language within the sample, so about 30%, followed by Spanish and German. This also reflects the countries represented in the sample, with Spain being the highest with 18%, followed by the UK and Germany, both 12.6. While we originally sampled in more influential accounts, we took some of them out to sample in other not so influential accounts to cover all 28 EU member states, so that we got a full coverage of everyone. And as part of our exploratory analysis, we investigated the top hashtags, hashtag co-occurrences, and URLs. So 23.2% of the tweets contained hashtags. Of them, white genocide was the most common hashtag used. This was also a finding that J.M. Berger, who also released a great report with Voxpol last year entitled The Alt-Right Twitter Census, he also found that white genocide was in the top 25 hashtags, so that wasn't such a surprise. Second and third were German politics-related hashtags, so Alternative for Germany, AfD, and Merkel. Merkel wasn't a surprise here either, because across Europe she was seen as a hate figure amongst the extreme right because of her liberal immigration policy during the migration crisis. There's also, given that this was a European sample, there's also reference to Trump, which features quite highly in the top 10 hashtags, and MAGA, Make America Great Again. I will talk a bit about the transnational links in the next slide. And in addition to this, there were also Brexit, ALBDE, that's a far-right Spanish group, so it's also not surprising because Spain featured heavily in our sample, as well as other hashtags relating to Islam, ISIS, etc. When we look at hashtag co-occurrences or hashtag pairs, so when a hashtag occurs in the same tweet as another hashtag, 45.8% of tweets with hashtags contain more than one hashtag. As white genocide was the most common hashtag, it's not surprising that it featured a lot alongside other hashtags, but it also featured amongst populist themes such as Trump and Brexit. In addition to this, and this also raises the issue of whether the hashtags were used as a means to infiltrate the mainstream debate or whether they resonated with them. In the report, we actually link this. So there's a lot of US-based hashtags, as I said, so a lot to do with the election of Trump, or the pre-election. And in this report, we actually link this finding back to other literature, which has investigated the transnational links online amongst the far right and the kind of pooling together of tactics during elections. And we can talk about that a bit in the Q&A. I won't go into detail now. And in addition to this, with the hashtag pairing, it highlighted particular trends in the discourse as well as particular triggers. So, for example, the refugee crisis, national elections, and this is an indication of where the extreme right were quite active. We also looked at outlinks, so 34.7% of the tweets contained URLs. A lot of them outlinked to YouTube, actually, but in terms of news websites, there was also linking to right-leaning and explicitly far-right news sites. So mainstream right-leaning would be, for example, Mail Online from the UK or Daily Express and Die Welt in Germany. But there were also links to more fringe media outlets such as Breitbart, Russia Today, and Sputnik News. These were generally used to kind of substantiate evidence presented in the tweet. So it was mostly about concerning refugees or immigrants and the crimes that they were committing. There were also outlinks to more underground content. So there were websites and blogs centering around conspiracy theories, and such as David Duke from the Ku Klux Klan and the extreme right website Daily Stormer. In terms of general themes and questions that emerged from this rather exploratory part of the analysis, what we found in general was that Twitter was used mostly to disseminate content related to Muslims, immigrants, and current affairs, rather than to advocate violence. They promoted right-wing populist parties and figures and themes such as the AfD, Trump, and Brexit. There was a general theme, especially within the avatars and the imagery, of defending European culture, identity, and race through creating a narrative of white Nordic roots. This is quite common amongst the extreme right. Many of the posts were explicitly anti-Semitic, with some also using the platform to deny the Holocaust. And also, as they were promoting right-wing populist parties and figures, it demonstrates that radical parties and issues are resonating with the more extreme right. Perhaps this is common sense because the extreme right would promote radical populist parties as it's kind of the closest to the mainstream as they can get. But what Daniela and I were interested in finding out was, is this relationship one-sided, or do they kind of feed off of each other? And are the right-wing populists more innocent, so to speak? So this brought us on to the more detailed second study, which is a qualitative analysis. And we decided to look at the issue of overlaps within 3 different groups operating in the right-wing scene online in Germany. We chose Germany as the quantitative analysis that I just showed you revealed a high level of interest in German domestic politics across the European extreme right scene. So just to give you a background to each of the groups, the first one that is identified as extreme right are the autonomous nationalists, also shortened to AN. The AN emerged through an attempt actually to modernize the extreme right, primarily by using and adopting left-wing symbols and actions. So they use the black bloc which is something that the far left also use. They wanted to move away from this traditional image of kind of skinheads in combat boots, so they appeal a lot to younger audiences as well. After some years of decline, a revival is currently taking place due to the opportune cross-pollination of the refugee crisis and also an increased presence online. They're increasingly using social media. They are a violent group, and they reject procedural democracy. The German Office for the Protection of the Constitution has officially classified them as a neo-Nazi group. The next group, the Identitärbewegung Deutschland, or Identitarian Movement Germany, referred hereafter as IBD. They're not a group limited to Germany. You might have heard of the Identitarian movement. They are across Europe. They are also known as Generation Identity in the UK and Ireland. They are what we call a new right group. So a bit like the autonomous nationalists, they appeal more to younger audiences, but they have more sophistication in terms of their theoretical roots, which can be traced back to the French Nouvelle Droite, or directly translated New Right. Most of you are French speakers anyway, so I didn't need to tell you that, which was a school of political thought which developed in France in the late 1960s. This sophistication is largely attributed to calls to modernize the scene, again, like the autonomous nationalists, but instead they produce high quality intellectual content that would resonate with audiences outside of the traditional right-wing subculture. So it's less about violence, but more about intellectual roots. The identitarians locate their intellectual and theoretical foundations within the new right, presenting themselves as a modern, not extremist right-wing movement. There's an interesting case actually with the Office for the Protection of the German Constitution. In July 2019, they actually classified the IBD, so the German chapter of the identitarian movement, as a movement that beyond doubt pursues right-wing extremist efforts. The identitarian movement in Germany challenged this in court, and actually the court agreed with the identitarian movement. That was the administrative court in Cologne, and now it's going to the higher administrative court in Münster because the Office for the Protection of the Constitution is disputing this. So it's quite interesting because, again, with classifications and so forth. And the final group, I'm also sure that a lot of you are familiar with, Alternative for Deutschland, Alternative for Germany, AfD. They are a right-wing populist party with a clear nativist agenda. In the 2017 federal elections, the AfD were the third largest party with 12.6% of the vote. They are also doing very well in state elections as well at the local level. And the AfD's position in German politics and representation in the German parliament has brought their issues closer to the mainstream debate, so they are very significant in this respect. So to delve deeper into the tweets that we were looking at, we decided to utilize frame analysis as our theoretical framework. So framing theory basically argues that in order to understand mobilization, it is not sufficient to know and understand ideology, but rather how messages are constructed in order to attract supporters and motivate them to action. And there's two components here, which is the actual frame or message, the core framing task, followed by the resonance criteria. I will go through all of these when I go through the examples, so it should become clearer. We supplemented frame analysis as well with visual analysis and an hermeneutic intertextual reading of posts and the consideration of narratives uttered in a minimalistic form, also known as tropes. There has been research on this whole idea of framing and linking also the extreme right to the radical populist right or the new right. And this has been done in the framework of the idea of master frames and cycles of protest. So this is the idea that new cycles of protest occur through novel master frames. And in this case, the new right and the radical populist right have successfully adopted a new master frame, which has replaced biological racism, which we see in the context of the extreme right, with themes such as ethno-nationalism, identitarianism, and anti-establishment populism. So we also use this as a guide and to guide our conclusion, which I will show you at the end. So just a note on the sample and context of when we collected the data. So we collected the tweets from the 1st of August to 30th of October 2018 from the Autonomous Nationalist, Identitarian, and the AFD Twitter accounts. This was a significant period because there were state elections in Hesse and Bavaria. This was the last in the round of state elections whereby the AFD celebrated the fact that they obtained seats in all local parliaments. It was also the announcement by Chancellor Angela Merkel concerning her withdrawal as leader of the CDU. Of course, as I said, Merkel has been a main target of critique within the far right and extreme right scene in Germany and Europe, and her withdrawal was equally celebrated by the AfD as their own accomplishment. We also had here debates surrounding the UN Migration Pact, which brought this whole issue of the migration crisis closer to the fore. And at the end of August 2018, there was also the Chemnitz incident where a Syrian man and an Iraqi man were arrested for stabbing a German man. And this led to a lot of mass protests, and there was a lot of noise online at this time, especially around the accounts that we were looking at. So going back to the framing analysis, so the first criteria are the core framing tasks. And in this respect, the first one is the diagnostic frame. So what's the diagnosis? What's the problem? All three groups state in one way or another that the problem is that Germans and or Europeans are at risk of dying out. The source of the problem are foreigners, refugees, mass migration, mainstream parties, conspiratorial notions about the left, Chancellor Merkel, the elite, political correctness, homosexuals, NGOs, and Islam. So all three groups were basically saying the same thing, but they were articulating it in different ways. So with the extremist autonomous nationalists, the AN, they articulated this as a way of Volkstod, which is death of the people, death of the folk. This, of course, has connotations back to National Socialism as well. And Überfremdung, which means over-foreignization. The AfD and the identitarians both themselves talked about elimination or demise of Germans and Germany, and they blamed Islamization for this demise, or so-called demise. And the identitarians use this common phrase of a great replacement, which is a conspiracy theory that Europeans and Germans are being replaced by migrant populations. This relates, of course, to white genocide, which we saw in the quantitative analysis, and also what the AN say on Volkstod. The next core framing task is the prognostic frame. So what's the prognosis? What's the solution? All three groups agree that they want to end migration. There's the idea of deportation, specifically as well of migrants that commit crimes in Germany. And the identitarians also use the concept of remigration. They also encourage all three groups to increase birth rates amongst Germans in order to mitigate the so-called Great Replacement or Volkstod or demise of Germany. And of course, they want, all three groups encourage their followers to vote for right-wing parties to ensure that these issues are talked about at the higher level. What was quite interesting for us is that the extremist autonomous nationalists do not traditionally support parties as they operate rather on the streets and outside of the democratic system. But they showed recent support for the neo-Nazi party, the NPD. They were retweeting a lot from that party. DDW as well, it's another neo-Nazi party, the third way. And which really surprises, they even promoted the AfD, because before they would have said they were too mainstream. The final core framing task is motivational frame, so how to motivate potential audiences to action. The issue here for all three groups, again, was that the issues were framed in apocalyptic terms. So it's like, if you don't act now, we're going to be replaced. There is this idea of defending Europe, especially from the identitarians. You may have heard about this campaign led by the identitarian movement to stop refugees at sea, or defend German citizens, because this actually comes from the idea that the police and the government are not doing enough to protect German citizens, and thus it's up to these groups to set up protection zones, or Schutzzone. And this was especially in the aftermath of the Chemnitz incident, where they said that the police weren't doing their job. The autonomous nationalists and the identitarians were explicitly calling for vigilantism and violence, and the AFD did not explicitly support vigilantism, but it did in its tweets allude to a lack of protection from police and the need to do more. And they were also championing people that did act on behalf of the police, so to speak. Motivation also plays into this aspect of visuals, slogans, and captivating images, which they would usually use images of victims of specifically migrant crime. They also posted very emotive pictures of German children and pensioners who they claimed, the AFD were particularly doing this, who they claimed were being robbed of government money, which is allegedly going to refugees instead. So this was to motivate those type of voters, or especially older voters in that respect. As part of their image as a movement, the identitarians are very much into performing stunts and uploading edited versions professionally on YouTube. They get a lot of likes and shares, so they make something quite minor look a lot bigger than it is. And this is definitely shared amongst younger audiences within the movement as well. This is just an example from the autonomous nationalists, which I think very nicely, in a way, shows the prognostic, diagnostic, and motivational frames at play at once. The text reads, "Defend your home," so this whole defense narrative, "Stop over-foreignization," followed by hashtags belonging to the mainstream parties, and the advertisement of the state elections in Hesse and Bavaria. On the image of the pregnant woman, they state, "We believe in our youth," followed by the slogan, "For the people and homeland." So here they're criticizing the mainstream and left parties for their stance on immigration and encouraging German citizens to have babies, and that they say that they believe in the future of predominantly German children. This is from the identitarian, an example from the identitarian movement's Twitter page. So this was actually a link to a far-right news outlet, and this demonstrates the invasion hyperbole that they use a lot. And they use this mostly through stories of the imminent arrival of masses of individuals, and they use terms such as secret invasions, a lot of conspiracy, and great exchange, and the visual, of course, of this kind of ongoing stream. So this is to give the impression that it just doesn't stop. People keep coming to Germany. So we finished the core framing task, and now to look at the resonance criteria. So for a frame to work, essentially, it needs to be credible, and that depends on where you're getting your statistics from, and also who is articulating what you're saying. So for credibility purposes, all three groups utilize statistics, official statistics, from the Federal Statistics Office as well as the IMF, and they are used and they are misrepresented. So for example, the AFD posted a figure about migrants that had killed Germans within the last year, but they did not put this in the wider context of the amount of murders in Germany for the whole year. So the figures aren't wrong, but they're misrepresented. They also use mainstream press reports, a bit like the quantitative sample that I showed you, to substantiate arguments. And the AFD in particular consistently and constantly repost content, particularly referring to migrant crime. So this is kind of this idea that it keeps happening and it's not stopping. So even if there was one case a couple of months ago, they will keep reposting it as if it's a new occurrence. In terms of the three groups and how they do this differently, the autonomous nationalists have a link to more underground sites, which was not surprising because they create their own kind of empirical credibility, and they refer to media sources internal within their own scene. But so did the identitarians to a certain extent as well in that example that I showed you. The AFD like to boast that they have many academics within the party, so a lot of people with professor or doctor titles. If I'm not mistaken, the latest figure was that they are the second largest party in the Bundestag with a high proportion of academics. So this is also some kind of way to reinforce credibility. The identitarians, also as part of the new right wave, often refer to academics and intellectuals, and this is to reinforce the credibility of the articulators. This is an example from the AFD, which shows frame twisting and credibility. So the poster reads, Allahu Akbar, Europe belongs to us. And what I mean by twisting is, it says here, in 2013, it was the first so-called isolated incident. This is the Einzigen file. And this is something that they love to use because they say that the liberal left media always say that whenever there's an incident involving a migrant, it's a isolated incident. So here they say, okay, so in 2013, it was the first isolated incident, and in 2017, in Hesse alone, there were 71 preliminary investigations into Islamic extremism. So they're twisting this idea of isolated incident, but also providing statistics to substantiate their argument. And the final resonance criteria is salience. So all three groups have looked towards nostalgia and particularly relating family values and traditional gender roles. The AFD had a campaign that they wanted to pay housewives. The autonomous nationalists also talked about rewarding housewives for staying at home. The identitarians, they also use the Battle of Vienna from 1683 as a great symbolism. So every year they do a march in Vienna. And this is very symbolic because it's the last time there was an invasion from the east, and it's a symbol of defending Europe against Islam and the Turks. The autonomous nationalists also commemorate World War II in an alternative way. And there's also a lot of exploitation of the migrant crisis and linking to the issue of other perceived social, political, and economic grievances. This is a common thing within the far right of trying to tap into economic grievances and blaming, of course, migration or so forth. So now I come to the conclusions. The themes are virtually the same in terms of cultural purity, anti-establishment, anti-globalization, Islamophobia, etc. But we found that in terms of design and marketing, the AFD is actually clearly ahead. They were also the most influential group in terms of our influential scores, which you would find further information on in the report. They twist frames, use hyperbole, and make extensive use of modern audiovisual repertoires. So they're very appealing to younger audiences. If you compare them to how the mainstream political parties use Twitter, it's much more sophisticated. As I said before about this idea of the new master frame, what we argue actually at the end is that this replacement of biological frame, of racism master frame, is only cosmetic rather than substantial. This is because the formulation of the problem and the reference are the same, so foreigners and the German people. The combination of contemporary discursive innovations and of contemporary populist repertoires has, we argue, in fact resurrected and rebranded an existing ideational potential and has in effect united the far right. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ruth, for your interesting presentation and for having shared with us your methods, the results of your training analysis, and also your interesting conclusions, which you can read, of course, more in detail in the publication, as you said.